Welcome to this course on international economic law. In this first video, I'm going to present you Chapter 1, the concept of international economic law and the concept of the international economic order. So let's start with what is international economic law. Obviously, it is international, it is economic, and it is law. So what do we mean by this? Well, it is international in the sense that it refers to the law that applies to cross-border transactions. That is to say, any transaction that has some connecting element with two or more legal orders. It is economic in the sense that it refers to economic activity and also in the sense that it applies some insights from economic analysis. And finally, it is law because it deals with the law that governs international economic relations. With regard to this last point, however, we might ask ourselves at what level of legal rules are we concerned with in international economic law? Well, first we have rules governing economic relations between subjects of international law, states and international organizations. So we're talking about international law in its narrow sense. Then we have rules that govern how states treat individuals engaged in cross-border transactions. So these are rules that also regulate of international law, that also regulate how states may act in regulating these cross-border transactions and individuals engaged therein. And finally, we have rules governing private economic transactions. Now, these rules that govern private economic transactions are typically the central topic of private international law. And as such, we're not going to be focusing on them as we're going to look at international economic law in the sense of rules of public international law that govern the economic process, that is, the creation, the protection, the circulation, and redistribution of wealth. Okay, so in international economic law, we have to follow an interdisciplinary approach with a number of disciplines, such as international economics, as we're going to see some of the key insights behind legal rules in international economic law are taken over from international economics. And one of the introductory topics we'll discuss is the so-called law of comparative advantage, as well as the issue of balance of payments. These are two economic concepts that play a key role in international economic law, as we will see. Second, we have constitutional law. As we will see, a lot of the debate around issues of international economic law also has a constitutional dimension. In domestic constitutional law, for instance, in Portugal, the treaty-making power is allocated to Parliament that must ultimately provide its consent to international treaties. But as we will see, a lot of international economic law is really produced within the sphere of intergovernmental cooperation, particularly in the context of international organizations. So the question then is, what is the legitimacy of this international economic law that is devised not with the involvement of parliaments, but with the involvement strictly of governments? So international economic law raises issues regarding the separation of powers within the constitutional legal order of each state. That, as we will see, will also play a key role in understanding the shape and some of the questions raised by international economic law. Then we have international relations, which is a part of political science. International relations also provides us some important insights into how states cooperate and why they cooperate. And so, although it is not a legal discipline, it does also provide valuable insights for any international lawyer. Finally, we have regional and national economic law. International law tends to create a form of superstructure, a framework that regulates only certain aspects of international economic transactions. The remaining aspects are typically dealt with under regional, in the case EU law, for instance, as well as domestic economic law. So, although we will not be focusing on any specific legal regime, we have to take into account this interdisciplinarity between domestic and supranational, in the case of the EU, economic law and international economic law. As we will see, international economic law provides a form of coordination of the exercise of domestic and supranational legal powers. Now, from what we've said so far, international economic law tends to describe more than explain, in the sense that we tend to attribute to international economic law a given number of disciplines: trade, investment, monetary affairs. But this does not really provide us with a guiding principle that connects all these different areas of international economic law. To some extent, that is the role that the concept of an international economic order tends to assume. That is, a normative approach to how we deal, how we regulate economic activities in a global economy. So the concept of an international economic order is a key also to understand, or to have a broader view of the subject of international economic law, going beyond the mere description of different legal regimes. Professor Petersman has defined international economic order as relating to rules that both regulate the international flow of goods, services, and capital, whilst creating an order that protects the reasonable expectations of economic actors. Now, the idea here is that in order for economic transactions to occur, particularly in a market economy type of global economy, then economic agents need to form these reasonably correct expectations as to how their future transactions will take place, and particularly with regard to the types of government intervention that might interfere with the conduct of such international transactions. Now, note that this is a rational construct, so there is no natural international economic order. So this is simply a construction, a rational construction, a rationalization of different aspects of the de facto economic order that we find. To complete this chapter and looking forward, do reflect on what functions an international economic order, a normative order, that is to say, an order as to how legal rules should really be developed, and thus also providing us a framework to assess the performance or not of these functions. I would argue that we need to have these three functions into account. First, efficiency. The world's resources are scarce, and so the world, an international economic organization, should be concerned with efficiency, with an efficient allocation of these scarce resources. Now, this does not mean exploiting resources without end. For instance, they have to take into account environmental concerns and also environmental concerns that bring social costs. And this is the so-called internalization of social costs that we will discuss later on. So it might be efficient to use oil now, but that's because the price of oil does not reflect the environmental damage created by using oil. So by adopting measures that internalize these social costs, then the price of oil would necessarily have to increase through taxation, for instance, so that when consumers adopt a decision to use fossil fuels or fuels derived from fossil fuels, then they have to take into account the cost. Fairness is the second pillar. Fairness in the sense that, in the same way that if you think of a national social contract or social compact, that provides legitimacy and safeguards distributive justice, thus creating the key elements to bind together a community, a normatively valid international economic order should also strive to reach this goal among nations. So, fairness now not within a specific nation, but fairness among nations. And Thomas Frank, as you can see here in this picture, and John Rawls were two key authors in this field. And finally, stability. As Professor Petersman said, economic actors do require stable factual and legal order so that they can make predictable decisions. So, an international economic order should also provide this stability function. And okay, that's all for this chapter, and I'll see you in class.